Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Slavery in the 19th Century South. 1. From Contradiction to Defense. The strongest card in the hands of American abolitionists was their ability to indict the entire American nation for what appeared to be the most hypocritical contradiction in all human history. A nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal happened also to be the nation, by the mid-19th century, with the largest number of slaves in the Western Hemisphere, a nation whose most valuable exports, particularly cotton, were produced by slaves. Indeed, far from being a marginal misfortune, African-American slavery pulsated at the heart of the national economy, and thus at the core of American political culture. If by the 1850s the North seemed well launched on an alternative road of industrial capitalism, the two sections were closely linked in terms of trade, finance, insurance, family bonds, and even the slave-grown cotton, rice, hemp, tobacco, and sugar that Northerners consumed in exchange for all the products they sold in the South. By the 1850s, too, following the annexation of Texas and California, the high confidence of some slaveholding Southerners emerged in dreams of annexing and expanding tropical empire ranging from Cuba to Nicaragua. Of course, Northerners and Southerners clashed over such issues as extending slavery to California and Kansas, and the very presence and increasing public support of abolitionists can be interpreted as evidence that revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality were acquiring new life, and might make a difference in shaping the future of a nation that had more than tripled in size since the beginning of the century. As Americans argued over their momentous contradiction, British travelers, who began arriving in increasing numbers in the 1820s, took delight in exposing and ridiculing the extraordinary inconsistency of a freedom-touting democracy based on slave labor. The English also loved to lampoon the Americans' boorishness, greed, arrogance, and terrible inns and roads, to say nothing of the Americans' filthy habit of spitting tobacco in all directions. As England took the leadership in trying to suppress the international slave trade and began debating whether to emancipate all the slaves in its own colonies, English travelers and writers were able to expose a much deeper and more vulnerable American evil. Morris Birkbeck, an English immigrant who left Virginia for Illinois, because he did not want to degrade himself and corrupt his children by living in a slave state, described in 1818, in a widely read book, what it was like to watch the sale of two slave women and their children on a Virginia street. I could hardly bear to see them handled and examined like cattle, and when I heard their sobs and saw the big tears roll down their cheeks at the thought of being separated, I could not refrain from weeping with them. Isaac Holmes, another English critic, was also appalled by the vice and corruption he saw when traveling through the South in 1823, following the explosive debates in Congress over admitting Missouri as a slave state. The Americans may boast of the rights of man, the great law of nature, as being the basis of their Constitution. They may declaim against tyranny and oppression. Yet every man who becomes a slaveholder in Missouri is a tyrant of their creation. The effects of slavery are truly appalling. Where slavery exists, virtue and morality are swept away as with a flood of corruption. Of course, Holmes's England, with its exceptionally hierarchical system of social classes, was hardly free from tyranny and hypocrisy. Even many decades later, an English wage laborer, who on his own prompting quit his job or moved to a new employer, could easily be imprisoned for breaking a highly coercive contract. Holmes was writing at a time when British women and small children still worked on their hands and knees in unbelievably oppressive British mines. Apart from the noxious conditions in British factories and mines, there were also psychological aspects to the judgments of Britons when they thought of Americans winning independence from a former mother country, when they thought of a rebellious English-speaking people who in the 1770s had committed a verbal and symbolic form of regicide. By the same token, the emergence in America of so-called Jacksonian democracy presented a direct threat, similar in some ways to the communism of the 20th century, of bringing on class warfare in Britain and the toppling of royal and aristocratic privilege. Frances Trollope, mother of the well-known novelist Anthony Trollope, in her famous Domestic Manners of the Americans, 1832, remarked that they inveigh against the governments of Europe, because, as they say, they favor the powerful and oppress the weak. You may hear this declaimed in every drawing-room, satirized upon the stage, nay, even anathematized from the pulpit. Listen to it, and then look at them at home. You will see them with one hand hoisting the cap of liberty, and with the other flogging their slaves. British critics also used attacks on slavery in America as a vehicle for exposing such supposedly democratic manners as bragging, a proclivity to violence, and a refusal on the part of whites to take servile jobs. Thus, Frances Trollope commented on the fact that it is more than petty treason to the Republic to call a free citizen a servant. Thanks to the understood presence of racial slaves, Americans could show off their egalitarianism by referring hypocritically to white servants as their help instead. White Americans not only disliked the word servant, but refused to be treated the way English servants had been treated for centuries. According to Trollope, young white women were even taught that the most abject poverty is preferable to domestic service. Another Englishman, who took his male servant with him on a visit to America's western country, was shocked to find that his boots had not been cleaned for 2 days. The servant, when questioned, replied that it was Negro's work to clean boots. It appeared that this English servant was quickly learning how to become Americanized. In this probably exaggerated tale, the servant then refused at dinner to stand behind his master's chair, as was customary in England. Instead, the servant sat at the table beside his master, announcing that this was a land of liberty and equality. Even if apocryphal, this parody of democracy highlights the process by which the ever-present dichotomy between slave and free could erode or disguise class differences among whites. In Chapter 6, we have already taken note of the historian Edmund Morgan's thesis that in the 17th and 18th century Chesapeake, black slavery became the necessary basis for white freedom and equality. Moving on to 1820, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who had spent much of his youth in Europe, expressed surprise and shock when John C. Calhoun, a fellow cabinet member, confided to Adams that one of the major benefits of racial slavery was its effect on lower-class whites, who could now take pride in their skin color and feel equal to the wealthiest and most powerful whites. Thus, slavery in Calhoun's eyes diffused class conflict. Precisely because slavery was the most extreme instance of inequality, it helped to make other relationships seem relatively equal. We should also consider the example of an Englishman like Thomas Cooper, who totally acculturated himself to the southern slaveholding world. In England, Cooper had been an eminent scientist, lawyer, and political radical, who supported the French Jacobins, and even called for the abolition of the slave trade. Then, in America, he became a close friend of Thomas Jefferson, taught for a while at the University of Pennsylvania, received an honorary M.D. degree from the University of New York, and in 1820 became professor of chemistry and then president of South Carolina College. Having moved increasingly toward ultra-conservative politics, Cooper, late in life, emerged as a brilliant defender of slavery and states' rights. Pro-slavery ideology, to which we will later turn, did not require a nurturing from childhood in a slave society. For their part, America's defenders of slavery could point to other forms of hypocritical contradiction. The moralistic abolitionists in New England, and especially Old England, seldom acknowledged the great fortunes amassed by slave-trading families in Rhode Island or in Liverpool, Bristol, and London. From the late 17th century onward, Britain had been by far the greater transporter of African slaves to the New World, stopping only in 1808. In subsequent decades, despite all the anti-slavery rhetoric, private British firms continued to supply ships, chains, manacles, insurance, and trading goods for both legal and illegal foreign slave traders. Moreover, the British abolitionists and petition signers, who had no need to face the social consequences of emancipating hundreds of thousands of slaves, were heartily demanding a massive migration of freed blacks to join the British proletariat. Nor should it be forgotten, many Southerners added, that the entire British cotton textile industry depended on slave-grown cotton, some 70% of which came from the American South. And by the 1840s, when the British Caribbean's plummeting plantation production and land values confirmed the worst predictions on the economic consequences of slave emancipation, England turned after much debate to a new policy of free trade, and thus benefited enormously from the productivity of the foreign slave systems in Cuba, Brazil, and the United States, nations that had to take the political responsibilities for maintaining the cheapest and therefore most exploitive labor system. That said, abolitionists were committed to the distinctively modern view that the status quo and legacies from the past need not be tolerated, that no beneficial ends or economic benefits could justify a system in which one human being treats another like a domesticated animal, or a saleable tool or instrument. With respect to our initial theme of contradictions, abolitionists seized upon the central contradiction at the very heart of slavery. Even ancient Roman writers like Seneca wrestled with the conviction that slaves were in some sense equal and capable of true virtue, much as early Christians declared that a slave could be a saint and his master a sinner. Yet what made slavery so appealing and seductive, especially in the long era before self-powered appliances, engines, and other labor-saving devices, was the freedom it brought for slaveholders. Thus, slave labor gave Aristotle the time to contemplate the nature of man and worldly existence, much as it freed Washington to lead the American Revolution, and Jefferson to compose the Declaration of Independence. And from earliest antiquity, writers drew parallels between both the treatment and behavior of slaves and those of domestic animals, often implying that the dehumanization or bestialization of slaves could serve the psychological function of elevating the oppressor, and even generating the illusion of something approaching divine power. Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery, well understood and articulated both the process and effects of dehumanization. He knew all too well what it was like to be treated as an animal. It bears repeating to note that when young Douglass was sent to be psychologically conditioned by the slave-breaker Edward Covey, Douglass's intellect languished, and he had no desire to read. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold a man transformed into a brute. Douglass goes on to report that he spent Sundays, his only leisure time, in a beast-like stupor. When he did read and learn the truth about Africans being stolen from their homes, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. It was only after Douglass resorted to physical force and overcame Covey that he could feel himself to be truly a man. It was a glorious resurrection, from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. He now resolved that however long he might remain a slave in form, he would never again be a slave in fact, that is, in his own sense of self-identity. Douglass's account illuminates the heroic efforts on the part of many enslaved African Americans to resist attempts at dehumanization. Harriet Jacobs, in her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, reiterates the theme of internal resistance to degradation, in her case, sexual degradation. When he told me that I was made for his use, that I was nothing but a slave, whose will must and should surrender to his, never before had my puny arm felt half so strong. My master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will. There is might in each. These accounts reflect a certain heroism, but also suggest that the very worst effect of bondage occurred when men and women internalized their master's desires and perceived themselves as slaves not only in outward form, but in inward fact. Scholars have done much to recognize and recover the heroic efforts of enslaved men and women to resist dehumanization. But to assume a homogeneity of 19th-century black experience, or to assume a uniform selfless political solidarity, is to lose sight of our shared humanity, not only our triumphal possibilities, but also our profound limitations. This point leads to the final example of contradictions within contradictions, the slave who eventually becomes a master and an owner of slaves. In parts of Africa, where the dangers of being enslaved were even greater than the chances of being freed, some slaveholders actually became the slaves of their former slaves. In the Caribbean, sharp distinctions of color made it much easier than in the United States for some emancipated slaves or their descendants to become owners of slaves. We have already noted that in Saint-Domingue, Jean de Couleur owned as many as 100,000 slaves. With respect to color, colonies like Jamaica gave informal recognition to a hierarchy, ranging upward from free blacks and Sambos, the offspring of a black and a mulatto, to mulattoes, quadroons, musties, and persons deemed white because of being 4 generations or more removed from a black ancestor. While freedmen were divided among themselves by color, wealth, occupation, and town or rural residence, they shared a common quest for equality with whites, and an orientation to white values. They were eager for honor, to use the words of a Spanish priest referring to the free-colored in Puerto Rico, and were quick to take affront if anyone implied they were darker in color than their own self-image. Since Jamaican society openly sanctioned informal conjugal unions between white men and black women, some of the most respectable and refined colored women thought it more honorable to be the mistress of a white man and bear children who might be considered white or near white than to marry a colored husband. This general pattern prevailed through much of the Caribbean and Latin America, where white males greatly outnumbered white females, and where generations of intermixture had produced a large class of free coloreds. Somewhat similar racial distinctions appeared in parts of the lower South, especially in Louisiana, which became a haven for French West Indian refugees, and which had also acquired under French and Spanish rule a tradition of open racial intermixture. At least until the later antebellum period, the lower South remained relatively flexible in its treatment of freedmen and their descendants. Despite strict restrictions on manumission, Louisiana and even South Carolina had made room for a small number of privileged free coloreds, some of whom became slaveholding planters. William Ellison, for example, was born a slave in 1790 in upcountry South Carolina. As a young mulatto apprentice, he learned the new and highly prized craft of making and repairing cotton gins. After apparently purchasing his own freedom in 1816, Ellison changed his name from April to William, bought freedom for his de facto wife and daughter, and shrewdly won the respect of his white clients and neighbors. Almost immediately he purchased slaves to work in his gin shop, building the economic foundation of his freedom on slave labor, and eventually became a major cotton planter and owner of 63 slaves. He even won a lawsuit against a white man who refused to pay his bills. By 1860, Ellison's property holdings placed him among the richest 10% in South Carolina's wealthy Sumter district. He owned more slaves than 97% of South Carolina's other slaveholders. In Louisiana, there were colored planters who possessed more slaves and were even richer than Ellison. To turn from contradictions and paradoxes to the actual rise of the Cotton Kingdom, Southern planters beginning about 1820 benefited from 3 economic advantages unavailable in the North. First, the climate and soil of large parts of the South were ideally suited for growing short staple cotton, the indispensable raw material for the early Industrial Revolution. The South thus produced an exportable product for which there was an international demand. The perfection of the cotton gin and screw press, devices for extracting cotton from the plant and compressing it into bales, gave Southerners benefits of technological innovation that Northerner farmers did not begin to approximate until the late 1850s, and even by 1860 over 80% of the American population lived in rural regions. In contrast to Northern family farms, the larger Southern plantations were more like the agribusinesses of the later 20th century in terms of size, efficiency, and complex organization. A second Southern advantage can be seen in the rapid improvements and widespread use of steamboats that opened the way to upriver navigation of the Mississippi, to say nothing of other boat travel along the rich network of Southern rivers from the Savannah and Potomac to the Arkansas. Such rivers outdid even Northern canals in lowering transportation costs. Third, and most important in purely economic terms, Southern agriculture could exploit the coerced labor of black slaves, especially in field gangs, in which slaves were forced to work at maximum speed and efficiency by black drivers who positioned workers according to their relative strength and speed of labor. In some ways, as we have seen, foreshadowing the time and motion studies of the early 20th century. Scholars still dispute some questions relating to the economics of American slavery. But during the past 30 years, a broad consensus has confirmed the arguments of Stanley L. Engerman and Nobel laureate Robert William Fogel concerning the extraordinary efficiency and productivity of plantation slave labor, which in no way implies that the system was less harsh or even less criminal. The historian Seymour Drescher has also shown that most of the British and French political economists of the early decades of the 19th century rejected Adam Smith's overconfident assertion in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations that because of its incentives, free labor was always cheaper and more efficient and productive than slave labor. Wholly apart from these issues, no one could question the fact that America's shortage of white labor, in relation to available land, was a crucial condition affecting both northern and southern agriculture. Since land was generally accessible as a result of the death or removal of Indians, especially in the West, it was difficult for farmers to hire non-family labor in order to specialize, expand production, and take advantage of the rising demand for cash crops, such as wheat, cotton, and corn. In the North, this labor shortage led in time to improved transportation, labor-saving machinery, and promotional schemes to attract immigrants. But in the South, black slaves provided a highly mobile and flexible supply of labor. Even without significant illegal imports from Africa or the West Indies, the number of American slaves increased from 1.5 million in 1820 to nearly 4 million in 1860. This unprecedented natural increase of the slave population enabled white Southerners to clear and settle the vast cotton kingdom, extending from inland South Carolina and Georgia across Alabama and Mississippi to Louisiana, Arkansas, and eventually eastern Texas. Far too often, slavery in the American South has been pictured as a fixed and static institution, almost frozen in time. In reality, an immense domestic or internal slave trade transported close to 1 million slaves from the Chesapeake and other Atlantic coastal regions to the Old Southwest, centering on the lower Mississippi Valley. While some slaves accompanied their mobile owners as they moved westward, most were sent by slave ships around the Florida Keys to ports like New Orleans, or were sold at auctions and to professional traders, who marched them in shackles hundreds of miles, sometimes for as long as 7 or 8 weeks, to the most profitable markets. Because slaves rightly dreaded such agonies, as well as being separated from spouses, parents, or children, masters continually used the threat of sale as a means of discipline and control. One former slave recalled that his master, come down to the quarters, determined to stop the slaves from making noise and disturbing him on Sundays. The angry master picked out de family that got de most chillin' and say, "For God, nigga, I'm gonna sell all dem chillin' of yourn, less'n you keep 'em quiet." Dat threat was worse'n prospects of a lickin'. Everybody sure keep quiet arter that. Whether slave sales were used for discipline or profit, their impact on African American families was disastrous. In 1852, Maria Perkins, a literate slave in Virginia, wrote a probably final letter to her husband, referring first to the sale of their son. "Dear husband, I write you a letter to let you know my distress. My master has sold Albert to a trader on Monday court day, and myself and other children is for sale also, and I want you to let me hear from you very soon, before next court, if you can, I don't know when. I want you to tell Dr. Hamilton and your master, if either will buy me, they can attend to it now, and then I can go afterwards. I don't want a trader to get me. I don't expect to meet with the luck to get that way till I am quite heartsick, nothing more. I am and ever will be your kind wife, Maria Perkins." Large planters and speculators could quickly transport an army of involuntary workers to clear rich western land, or could sell slaves to meet the labor demands of expanding areas. Some owners moved many slaves from urban centers out to the fields and then back to urban employment as cotton prices rose or fell. Even prospering family farmers could buy or rent a few slaves to increase their output of cotton or other cash crops. The renting of slave labor was widespread. The flexibility of the system also enabled planters to allocate needed labor to raising livestock and growing foodstuffs for domestic consumption. When market conditions improved, slaveholders could increase the proportion of work time devoted to cotton or other cash crops. In contrast to the free population, slaves began working as children and were burdened with orders and assignments even if they survived to old age. These various advantages meant that slaves became the major form of Southern wealth, aside from land, and slaveholding became the means to prosperity. Southern investment flowed mainly into the purchase of slaves, whose soaring price reflected an apparently limitless demand despite major fluctuations in the price of cotton. The large planters soon ranked among America's richest men. Indeed, by 1860, 2/3 of the wealthiest Americans lived in the South, a fact that became difficult to believe after the devastation of the Civil War and the full industrialization of the North. As late as 1863, well after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the president of a North Carolina railroad could assure his stockholders that although slave prices were very high now, slaves were worth probably only 1/2 what they would be at the end of the war. This is only one of many examples of the strength and confidence of the slaveholding South. The later impoverishment of the South nourished the myth that the slave economy had always been historically backward, stagnating, and unproductive. We now know that investment in slaves brought a considerable profit, and that the Southern economy grew rapidly throughout the pre-Civil War decades. It is true, however, that the system depended largely on the international demand for cotton, as the world entered the age of industrialization, led by the British textile industry. There was an increasing demand for clothing that was cheaper than linen, and not as hot and heavy as wool. At times, the South's production of cotton exceeded international demand, and cotton prices fell sharply in the economic recessions that followed the panics of 1819 and 1837. But until the Civil War, the world market for cotton textiles grew at such a phenomenal rate that both Southern planters and British manufacturers thought only of infinite expansion. By 1840, the South grew more than 60% of the world's cotton and supplied not only Britain and New England, but also the rising industries of continental Europe, including Russia. Throughout the antebellum period, cotton accounted for over half the value of all American exports, and thus it paid for the major share of the nation's imports and investment capital. A stimulant to northern industry, cotton also contributed to the growth of New York City as a distributing and exporting center that drew income from commissions, freight charges, interest, insurance, and other services connected with the marketing of America's #1 commodity. Though the South continued to export large quantities of rice, tobacco, and other cash crops, Southern business conventions unsuccessfully called for a more balanced economy. Except for the bustling port of New Orleans and a few small cities like Richmond and Mobile, great urban centers failed to appear. Internal markets failed to grow. Most European immigrants, including Germans, German Jews, and Irish, had no wish to compete with slave labor. Immigrants generally shunned the region, though there are a few examples of Irish laborers who allied themselves with slaves, and some Irish railroad workers in Texas were regarded by white Southerners as even more lowly and degraded than slaves. The greatest single peril to the Southern slavocracy was the possible disaffection of non-slaveholding farmers and workers, followed by an alliance with blacks, both slave and free. This point underscores the crucial function of racism and racial identity, which succeeded in maintaining much unity among whites. For all its shortcomings, the slave economy was anything but inflexible. In Louisiana, wealthy sugar growers expanded production by using the newest technology for the processing of cane. Some Southerners effectively applied slave labor to the cultivation of corn, grain, and hemp, for making rope and twine, to mining and lumbering, to building canals and railroads, and even to the manufacture of textiles, iron, and other industrial products. Nevertheless, no other American region contained so many white farmers who merely subsisted on their own produce. The typical white Southerner was not a slave-holding planter, but a small farmer who tried, often without success, to achieve both relative self-sufficiency and a steady income from marketable cash crops. In no other American region had agriculture become so speculative and commercial, for small cotton farmers who could not afford slaves, as well as for the planter elite. Like some of the later Third World regions where involuntary labor produced raw materials for industrial nations, the South was intimately connected with industrial capitalism and yet cut off for various reasons from its liberalizing and diversifying influences. From the time of the Revolution, a cautious, genteel distaste for slavery had been fashionable among some of the planters of the Upper South. This Jeffersonian tradition persisted even after the tiny number of true abolitionists had been driven from the land, and after Methodist and Baptist leaders had backtracked on various resolutions encouraging gradual emancipation. The desire to find some way of ridding the South of its burden, blight, or curse, as the Jeffersonian reformers called it, was kept alive by some of the sons of affluent plantation owners who went to the North or to Europe to study. Moreover, in some regions possessing very few slaves, such as western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, small numbers of Quakers and Baptists continued to sustain anti-slavery societies. Even in the 1830s and 1840s, the hope of removing the South's burden won support from a few broad-minded plantation owners, mostly Whigs, who were troubled by the economic decline of the tobacco regions of eastern Virginia and Maryland, and by the continuing loss of population to the Old Southwest. In 1832, the belief that slavery was ruinous to the whites received unexpected support in the Virginia legislature from non-slaveholders who lived west of the Blue Ridge Mountains and in the region that later became West Virginia. Nat Turner's bloody slave revolt of 1831 alarmed many of Virginia's women, as well as men, and led to a momentous and unprecedented legislative debate over the possibility of slave emancipation. In 1832, the representatives from Western Virginia had various motives for condemning slavery and challenging the political control of tidewater planters, but in the end, their arguments demonstrated the pervasive power of white racism. Even the non-slaveholding radicals acknowledged that bondage was beneficial for blacks, and that its destructive effects on white society could be ended only by gradually freeing and deporting the entire black population. Emancipation seemed inconceivable unless coupled with the colonization of freed slaves, a view shared even much later by Northern leaders like Lincoln, and by virtually all whites except the small group of radical abolitionists. In the Virginia legislature, the anti-slavery delegates failed even to carry a resolution that would have branded slavery as an evil to be dealt with at some future time. In response to this legislative debate, Thomas R. Dew, a professor of law, history, and political economy at the College of William and Mary, wrote a book that became a famous turning point in the Southern defense of slavery as a rational and superior form of labor management. Looking to the long-range future, Dew even predicted that in 1929 our police would be much more efficient than now, if the two castes, races, preserve anything like the same relative numbers. Though some moral doubts over slavery persisted in the Upper South, the gradualists tended to abandon the impractical notion of colonization and began to rely on what they termed diffusion, the hope that the slave population would slowly move southwestward toward Texas, Mexico, and tropical regions for which black people were supposedly suited. But after the 1830s, Southern intellectuals, clergymen, editors, and other professionals became increasingly determined to overcome the moral and self-interested doubts of the non-slaveholding majority. The aggressive anti-slavery assault from the North, and indirectly from Britain, actually made it easier to instill the conviction that emancipation in any form would be a disaster, for blacks as well as for whites. On the one hand, some Southerners channeled their moral concerns into dedicated efforts to reform, improve, and humanize the so-called peculiar institution. On the other hand, while the South remained highly diverse and divided on some issues, political statesmen like Virginia's Senator William C. Rives, President Andrew Jackson's cosmopolitan envoy to Paris, warned that for people of non-slaveholding states to discuss the question of slavery at all is to attack the foundation of the Union itself. Most of the arguments used to defend slavery were neither of Southern nor of 19th century origin. As soon as Judge Samuel Sewall published a rare anti-slavery pamphlet in Boston in the year 1700, John Safin launched a pro-slavery counterattack. Later in the century, when a burst of English pamphlets and sermons depicted the evils of the British slave trade, the wealthy West India interest sponsored a swarm of pamphlets defending both slavery and the slave trade with arguments ranging from the Bible to national interest. One of the primal sources for pro-slavery thought, regardless of time or place, was, of course, the Bible. In the Old Testament, God tells Moses that the ancient Israelites should take their male and female slaves from the nations round about you. You may also buy them from among the children of aliens resident among you. These shall become your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property for all time. And as we have seen in Chapter 3, Jews, Christians, and Muslims came up with various important interpretations of Noah's curse of Ham's youngest son. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers and their descendants. A few historians have erroneously minimized the importance of the curse of Ham as a means for white Southerners to justify the slavery of African Americans. As Thomas Virgil Peterson has shown, drawing on the anthropological theories of Clifford Geertz and Claude Lévi-Strauss, the biblical story sustained a worldview for Southern Presbyterians, Baptists, and Methodists by bringing together their racial stereotypes, political theories, religious beliefs, and economic realities. Above all, since most Southern Christians fervently believed in the descent of all humans from Adam and Eve, and could not accept the new theories of polygenesis, to which we will soon turn, Ham's sinful contempt for his father provided a way for distinguishing the animal-like Canaanite race from the superior descendants of the fair and comely Japheth, and even from the red or brown progeny of Shem. The curse of slavery was even good for the Canaanite race, since masters had a duty to Christianize their slaves, and according to one prominent agricultural reformer, the excesses of his Negro's animality are kept in restraint, and he is compelled to lead an industrious, sober life, and certainly a more happy one, than he would if he was left to the free indulgences of his indolent savage nature. For some Southern Christians, the biblical story fit into a larger defense of patriarchy, Noah being the first patriarch, as the only means of controlling mankind's natural inclination to evil. Though by the 1850s, some abolitionists were developing sophisticated and compelling arguments against patriarchies of many kinds. Still, the Noachic myth's power and longevity emerged in the 1950s when white Southern Christians revived the curse as a biblical defense of racial segregation. Moreover, the Hebrew Bible makes it clear that Abraham and many of the prophets owned slaves as a matter of course. In the New Testament, Jesus never speaks to a slave or criticizes the slaveholding that surrounded him, and key passages in Peter, Timothy, Titus, and Luke, some printed in chapter 2, exhort slaves to obey their masters and even justify the flogging of slaves. While the Bible also contains words that abolitionists could seize upon, the total absence of anti-slavery in antiquity gave comfort to religious planters, especially when abolitionists denounced every instant of slaveholding as a heinous sin. As for a second source, Aristotle set a long-lived precedent for defending bondage on natural and empirical grounds, by pointing to the actual inequalities in human physical strength and intelligence, by arguing that some people are simply born to serve, and by emphasizing the social and political benefits flowing from the slave owner's free leisure time. When considering the slavery debates, one should note that in 1850, 17.2% of Southern native white adults were illiterate, compared with 4.12% in the free states. Nevertheless, a relatively large number of young Southern men attended college, some traveling abroad, and many more to the north, especially to Princeton and Yale. Others made South Carolina College in Columbia a hotbed of Southern nationalism and radical pro-slavery thought. By the 1840s, some highly talented young intellectuals and writers had become determined to defend slavery while improving the level of Southern life and defining a distinctive Southern culture. Though outraged by abolitionist attacks, this sacred circle, as one group called itself, was less interested in a Northern audience than in unifying, spiritualizing, and revitalizing their society, much as transcendentalists and moral reformers were trying to do for the North. From Aristotle, Edmund Burke, and European Romantic reactions against the French Revolution and Enlightenment, these Southerners derived theories of the organic cohesiveness of society, the inevitability of inequalities, and the danger of applying abstract principles to human relationships, such as the slogan, "All men are created equal." While attracted by images of feudalism and the cult of chivalric honor, they were also committed, like most Southern clergy, to a belief in science, the wonders of technology, and historical progress. That said, figures like James Henry Hammond, the young governor of South Carolina, and George Frederick Holmes, a professor of history and literature at the University of Virginia, were deeply troubled by the threat of an individualistic, acquisitive society based on the capitalist wage system. According to the Sacred Circle, racial slavery was the labor system most conducive to the elevation of the intellect, since it protected some men from the allurements of greed and gave leisure to a master class that could cultivate mental improvement and refinement of manners. This was essentially a reworking of Aristotle's classic argument, but Aristotle was never able to identify the natural slave, and he admitted that men born to be free were sometimes wrongly enslaved by sheer force. For Southerners, a white skin was the distinguishing badge of mind and intellect. Black skin was the sign that a given people had been providentially designed to serve as menial laborers, as what Hammond called the mudsill class necessary to support every society. In his famous Cotton is King speech to the U.S. Senate in 1858, Hammond affirmed that in all social systems there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. Its requisites are vigor, docility, fidelity. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and political government, and you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other, except on this mudsill. Hammond and other Southern leaders considered themselves exceptionally fortunate in having found a race that had been created to be a mudsill. Like early New England Puritans, they had a mission to teach the world. Most pro-slavery theorists eagerly embraced at least part of the new science of ethnology. Its theories of racial inequalities promised to reconcile religion with empirical science. Holmes, for example, turned to the classic racialist work of the Frenchman Joseph de Gobineau, whose 4-volume The Moral and Intellectual Diversity of Races, 1856, helped to disseminate the doctrine of Negro inferiority through much of the Western world. Hammond also became close to Josiah C. Nott, a Southern physician who called his research the nigger business, and who drew on the scientific racism of Samuel Morton, George Glidden, and Louis Agassiz. The latter, a distinguished Harvard professor originally from Switzerland, preached the doctrine of polygenesis, arguing that Africans were a separately created and inferior species. Since Southern culture was so deeply oriented to orthodox interpretations of the Bible, including the primacy of Adam and Eve, this theory of separate origins was far too radical for most Christians to accept. Ironically, Darwin's science helped to restore the belief in a common human origin, today substantiated by both African archaeology and genetics. Men like Governor Hammond shied away from polygenesis. In 1845, in his famous 2 long public letters to the 85-year-old British abolitionist, Thomas Clarkson, Hammond simply declared that the African, if not a distinct, is an inferior race, and never will affect, as it never has affected, as much in any other condition as in that of slavery. For Hammond it was a stroke of genius, which won acclaim throughout the South, to respectfully address Clarkson, arguably the great founding father of all abolitionism, an Englishman no less, and then to demolish point by point the entire intellectual edifice on which Clarkson had based his life's work. Hammond disarmingly admitted at the outset that he had no wish to defend the African slave trade, which Clarkson had devoted almost a half a century of sustained effort to suppress. But then Hammond correctly observed that an illegal slave trade from Africa was still thriving and apparently could not be abolished by force, though the trade to Brazil would be stopped in 5 more years. Hammond's letters devoted much space to comparisons of Southern slavery with British industrialism. He admitted that one could find some evil and suffering in every society, but from the reports of commissioners appointed by Parliament, he quoted descriptions of English boys 8 to 12 years of age crawling on all fours in mine shafts, dragging barrows of 100 pounds of coal. He cited verified instances of children as young as 4 and 5 working in mines and factories, 12 hours a day, for $2.50 to $7.50 a month. There was much further evidence on English labor exploitation and on Irish famine and destitution. The great Irish potato famine, for which England was at least partly responsible, had just begun. Apart from the British abolitionists' hypocrisy and inconsistencies, Hammond argued that if their premises were logically extended to all property and authority, the result would be a complete disorganization of society, reducing man to a state of nature, red with blood and shrouded once more in barbaric ignorance. What Hammond called our patriarchal scheme of domestic servitude, in contrast, stimulated the finer feelings of human nature, as opposed to your artificial money power system. According to Hammond, abolitionists simply did not recognize what they were doing. Clarkson and his followers were striking at the very core of social unity, and were really disregarding what Hammond called the Negro's elemental humanity, since after emancipation the blacks would be cut off from all bonds with paternalistic and caring whites, abandoned to progressive decline and decay, a scenario supposedly verified in the mid-19th century by the history of Haiti and Sierra Leone. Such decline and decay, Hammond claimed, was already starkly apparent in the British West Indies, after only 7 years of freedom, a view, as we shall see in Chapter 12, that was winning increasing support in Britain. If Clarkson and other abolitionists objected to keeping men in bondage by the law of force, Hammond asked, "In what country do you see human affairs regulated merely by the law of love?" If Hammond were to get a glimpse of the world in modern times, he would no doubt be shocked by the nearly universal moral condemnation of slavery. But he might well feel vindicated by the research of a respected sociologist, who shows that in our allegedly free world, many millions of contract and indebted laborers in the so-called developing nations are physically forced like slaves to do the dirtiest work, often by labor contractors for multinational corporations. And Hammond would quickly point out that these modern slaves have no caring owners, as in the antebellum South, whose self-interest coincides with the good health and longevity of their servants and their servants' children. I am by no means implying any acceptance of Hammond's pro-slavery views, but it is often sobering to momentarily borrow the perspective of such critics. Hammond concluded by saying to Clarkson, "May God forgive you." He pictured the abolitionist, in other words, as a do-good dupe, whose reforms had brought far more harm than good to the world. In a later speech in the U.S. Senate, Hammond asserted, "Your whole hireling class of manual laborers and operatives, as you call them, are essentially slaves. The difference between us is that our slaves are hired for life and well compensated." As Hammond's letters and speeches demonstrate, the most striking part of the Southern pro-slavery ideology was its indictment of liberalism and capitalism. Its well-documented charge that the prevailing rule in so-called free societies, as George Fitzhugh put it, was every man for himself and devil take the hindmost. In his Sociology for the South, 1854, and Cannibals All, 1857, Fitzhugh sharply criticized the philosophic premises of an individualistic, egalitarian society. When all men are considered equal, he pointed out, all aspire to the highest honors and largest possessions. In a free society, none but the selfish virtues are in repute, because none other help a man in the race of competition. Fitzhugh also examined the destructive historical consequences of dissolving the social and psychological networks that had once given human beings a sense of place and purpose. While successful men in Britain and the North deluded themselves into thinking that their social system was fair and just, and congratulated themselves for their own affluence, the whole weight of society, Fitzhugh claimed, was thrown upon its poorest and weakest members, who were then condemned for failure. Fitzhugh, in some ways the most rigorous and consistent pro-slavery theorist, presented the master-slave relation as the only alternative to a world in which unlimited self-interest had subjected workers without property to the impersonal exploitation of wage slavery. Ironically, Fitzhugh carried on a fascinating correspondence with the radical abolitionist Gerrit Smith, who had married Fitzhugh's cousin. Characterizing himself as a reformer, Fitzhugh told Smith that his views of slavery as benign apprenticeship were not that different from Smith's abolitionism. For some years, Fitzhugh was consistent enough to renounce racial justifications for actual slavery and to propose that the benefits of the institution he boasted of be extended to white workers. As Abraham Lincoln pointed out, when with some alarm he read Fitzhugh's Sociology for the South, if enslavement were to be determined by intellectual superiority or skin color, one could be enslaved by anyone who was smarter or fairer in complexion. But Fitzhugh's arguments, however interesting theoretically, only showed how far he had moved from social reality. Virulent racism lay at the heart of the South's extremely shaky unity. The enslavement of whites was politically unthinkable, and in the 1850s, the South even rejected proposals for expelling or re-enslaving 250,000 free blacks. In the 1850s, Southern legislatures also rejected extremist but powerful moves to reopen the African slave trade in order to enable more middle-class whites to join the elite ranks of slave owners. The great mission of pro-slavery theorists was to convince and command the loyalty of non-slaveholding whites, who constituted a growing majority. In an early version of the American Dream, writers also stressed the goal of upward mobility and the possibility of joining the slaveholding class. Whatever moral doubts about slavery persisted, at least in the Upper South, they were more than counterbalanced by the growing conviction that emancipation in any form would be a disaster, for blacks as well as for whites. A few Southerners channeled their moral concern into efforts to reform and improve the system. Thus, in the 1850s, some clergy led a futile movement to legalize and protect slave marriage. But as the Southern states seceded and began to fight for their independence, pro-slavery ideology permeated school books, newspapers, speeches, and sermons. It was the mission of the Confederacy, ordinary whites were told, to carry out God's design for an inferior and dependent race. Slaveholders claimed that owning slaves always entailed a duty and a burden that defined the moral superiority of the South. And this duty and burden was respected by millions of non-slaveholding whites, who were prepared to defend it with their lives. That, perhaps, was the ultimate meaning of a slave society.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.